My dad smashed a brick into my face after my fiancé refused to leave me for my sister. Mom laughed and said, "Let us see if he still loves you." They had no idea what they had just started. My name is Caroline, and I am 33 years old. I work as a forensic accountant and senior risk director at a private equity firm in Manhattan. I spent my whole life trying to earn my family's love, but today I realize they only saw me as a punching bag. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut meant appearances were everything. My parents, Richard and Patricia, hosted their annual Labor Day barbecue with the kind of aggressive display of wealth that screamed insecurity. I had spent years analyzing fraudulent financial records for massive corporations, so spotting the fake wealth in my own family was second nature. My father's regional logistics company was quietly drowning in debt, yet he insisted on throwing this extravagant party just to maintain his country club status. Waiters carried silver trays of champagne around the manicured lawn while a jazz quartet played softly near the gazebo. I stood near the patio wearing a simple white silk dress and watching the crowd. I was supposed to be celebrating my recent engagement to Ethan. He is an estate planning attorney who is brilliant and grounded. He is the only person who truly sees me. But my family had a completely different agenda. My younger sister, Brittany, was currently holding court by the infinity pool. Brittany styled herself as a lifestyle influencer. She spent her days unboxing luxury goods funded entirely by our father's failing business. She had racked up massive amounts of secret credit card debt just to maintain her fake internet persona. Brittany absolutely hated that the attention was on me today, and she was determined to ruin it. I watched Ethan walk toward the pool to grab us some sparkling water. Brittany intentionally intercepted him. I could not hear her at first, but her body language was unmistakable. She leaned into him and ran a hand down his lapel. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Ethan took a sharp step back. His face flashed with absolute disgust. He did not lower his voice at all. In fact, he spoke loudly enough for half the patio to hear. "Brittany, you are completely delusional," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the jazz music. "I am marrying Caroline because she is brilliant and self-made. I have zero interest in calling off my engagement to be with a spoiled 30-year-old who still begs her parents for allowance money. Do not ever approach me like that again." The patio went dead silent. Dozens of wealthy guests turned to stare. Brittany turned beet red. For a second, she looked like she might scream in anger. Then her eyes darted to our father, who was grilling steaks nearby. Instantly, Brittany collapsed onto a poolside lounger. She clutched her chest and gasped for air in a wildly exaggerated fake panic attack. "He attacked me," Brittany wailed while pointing a trembling finger at Ethan. "He grabbed me and shoved me." My father dropped his tongs. Richard always needed an excuse to exercise his rage, especially toward me. His logistics company had been hemorrhaging money for years, and his temper had grown incredibly volatile. He charged across the patio with his face purple with fury, but he did not go for Ethan. He came straight for me. "You brought this monster into my home." Richard screamed with spittle flying from his lips. "You are always trying to ruin your sister's life out of sheer jealousy." I stood my ground and refused to flinch. "Dad, half your guests just watched Brittany throw herself onto that chair. Ethan did not even touch her." My calm logic only fueled his rage. He looked around wildly and grabbed a heavy, rough-cut landscaping brick from the edge of the patio planter. He swung it with all his might. The impact was deafening. The rough stone smashed directly into my left cheekbone and forehead. Pain exploded through my skull. It was white-hot and blinding. The sheer force threw me to the ground. My ears rang loudly and drowned out the sudden screams of the surrounding guests. Warm blood immediately poured down my face and soaked into the collar of my white silk dress. I pushed myself up onto my elbows while my vision blurred. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard my mother speak. Patricia was standing near the bar, holding her glass of Chardonnay. She did not rush to help me. She did not scream for an ambulance. Instead, she let out a sharp and cruel laugh. "Let us see if your rich lawyer still loves you," with a shattered face. Patricia mocked loudly for everyone to hear. "Maybe now you will finally learn your proper place in this family." Before I could even process her cruelty, someone dropped to their knees beside me. They pressed thick cloth napkins against my bleeding face. It was my sister-in-law, Jasmine. Jasmine is a federal tax prosecutor. She is a brilliant African-American woman married to my older brother, Michael. She has always despised my family's toxic elitism and their casual racism. Today she had seen enough. Jasmine glared up at my mother and her voice rang with absolute authority. "You let Brittany steal Caroline's entire college fund 10 years ago to pay for her plastic surgery, and now you stand there laughing while your husband shatters her skull. I am calling the police and pressing charges myself." My brother Michael stood frozen near the grill. He looked horrified, but was too weak to intervene against our father. Patricia scoffed and rolled her eyes as if Jasmine were simply being dramatic. "You cannot prove anything about that college money," Patricia snapped. "And this is our private property." My husband was just defending his youngest daughter from an aggressive man. In the distance, the faint wail of police sirens began to echo through the quiet Greenwich neighborhood. The sound grew louder with each passing second. My father heard them and sneered. He tossed the bloody brick onto the grass and casually pulled out his leather wallet. He was entirely unbothered by the fact that his daughter was bleeding heavily on his patio tiles. "Go ahead and let the police come," Richard bragged while a smug grin spread across his face. "I golf with the chief of police every single Sunday. I sponsor their charity drives. By the time they leave here today, Ethan will be in handcuffs for assault. And you will be on a mandatory hold in a psychiatric ward, Caroline." Ethan stepped forward. He bypassed my father entirely and kneeled down to help Jasmine support my shoulders. He pulled out his phone. The screen was still glowing from an active call. He looked up at my father with a calm and terrifying precision. "I did not call the local police, Richard." Ethan said, his voice completely void of emotion. "I called the state troopers, and since I am an attorney, I already informed them that a violent felony was just committed with a deadly weapon. They are not coming for a friendly chat. They are coming to arrest you." My father's smug grin vanished instantly. The sirens grew deafeningly loud as multiple heavy vehicles screeched to a halt at the front gates of the estate. The true consequences of his actions had just arrived. He had absolutely no idea that this was only the very first domino to fall in the complete destruction of his entire empire. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed above me as the attending physician pulled the final thread through my cheek. 12 stitches. That was the price of attending a family barbecue. Ethan stood beside the hospital bed, holding my uninjured hand so tightly his knuckles were white. Jasmine had stepped into the hallway to coordinate with the state troopers who were waiting to take my formal statement. The pain medication was slowly kicking in, but it did nothing to dull the sharp adrenaline rushing through my veins. Before the doctor could even apply the bandage, the door flew open. My father barged into the room with my mother hot on his heels. They had somehow managed to bypass the triage desk entirely by leveraging the same country club connections he always used to get his way. He did not look apologetic. He looked like a cornered animal ready to bite. Richard slapped a thick stack of stapled papers directly onto my lap. The bold print at the top read, "Non-disclosure and settlement agreement." "Sign it," my father commanded. His voice was a harsh hiss. "You sign that right now, Caroline, and you tell those troopers out there that you tripped and fell by the pool." Ethan immediately stepped forward and shielded me from them. "You need to leave this room right now, Richard, before I have you arrested for witness tampering." "Shut up, you glorified ambulance chaser," my father snapped at Ethan. He pointed a thick finger directly at my stitched face. "If you do not sign that paper, Caroline, I am making a phone call to the executive board of your private equity firm. I will tell them you had a drug-induced psychotic break. I will tell them you showed up high to a family event and attacked your own sister before coming after me. With your high-stress corporate job, they will believe me in a heartbeat. You will be fired by Monday morning and blacklisted in Manhattan by noon." Patricia stood behind him, clutching her designer purse like a shield. She looked at my bloody dress with absolute disgust. Listen to your father, Caroline. You have always been unstable. We are offering you a way out of this mess. Do not be ungrateful. Brittany is traumatized enough by your violent outburst. I looked down at the heavy legal document resting on my lap. A sharp laugh escaped my throat, making my fresh stitches burn and pull. You think you can ruin my career? I asked, my voice echoing off the sterile walls. My career is the only thing I have because of you. Do you honestly think this threat scares me? Ruin my career. Like how you forced me to work night shifts at the diner at 19 to pay off the medical debt you refused to cover. My father rolled his eyes, but I refused to let him interrupt. I had a ruptured appendix, I reminded them coldly. You told the hospital administration you were not financially responsible for me anymore because I chose to study accounting instead of joining your failing logistics business. You drove a brand new Porsche that year, while I served coffee and scrubbed diner tables until 3 in the morning just to pay off the surgery that saved my life. I built my career on top of your financial abuse. My father slammed his hand against the metal medical tray table. I do not care about ancient history, he yelled, making the medical instruments rattle. I care about today. You are going to sign that document, or your life in the financial sector is over. I have the board members of your firm on speed dial. I reached over to the bedside table with my free hand and picked up my iPad. I unlocked the screen and tapped into my secure corporate server. I calmly turned the screen around to face him. Go ahead and call my board, Richard, I said smoothly. Call them right now, but while you have them on the line, you should ask them about Vanguard Holdings. My father squinted at the glowing screen. The color immediately began to drain from his face as his eyes scanned the official corporate header and the heavily redacted financial figures beneath it. What is this? He demanded, his voice completely losing its aggressive edge. That is the holding company that just purchased the $4 million commercial mortgage on your logistics warehouse, I explained, watching his panic grow with deep satisfaction. Your business has been defaulting on its loans for 6 months. Your original bank sold the debt to a private equity firm to recoup their losses. Spoiler alert, Richard, I am the lead director of Vanguard Holdings. My mother gasped and grabbed my father's arm. Richard, what is she talking about? Our business is perfectly fine. Your business is drowning, I said, locking eyes with my mother. He has been hiding it from you to protect his precious country club image. He thought he was dealing with a faceless corporate entity when his debt got transferred. He had no idea I managed the portfolio that acquired his failing company. I set the iPad down and pushed the crumpled non-disclosure agreement off my lap. It fluttered to the hospital floor, landing right by my father's expensive leather shoes. You do not hold my future in your hands, Dad. I hold yours, and I am not signing anything. Jasmine just signaled the state troopers to come in. You should probably call your golf buddies now and see if they can post your bail. The state troopers escorted my father out of the emergency room, and the sterile silence that followed was deafening. The drive back to our Manhattan apartment felt entirely different from the drive to Connecticut that morning. The throbbing in my left cheekbone matched the rhythm of the car tires on the highway. Ethan kept his hand resting on my knee the entire way. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell me everything would be okay. He knew I needed strategy, not sympathy. We walked through the door of our apartment just past midnight. I kicked off my heels and dropped my blood-stained silk dress into the trash can. I threw on an oversized sweatshirt and sat at the kitchen island. That is when my phone started vibrating against the marble countertop. It was not just one notification. It was a continuous, relentless buzzing. Ethan handed me a glass of ice water and picked up my phone. His jaw tightened instantly. Brittany just posted a video, Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. He turned the screen toward me and pressed play. There was my 30-year-old sister sitting in her plush Connecticut bedroom. She was wearing perfectly smudged mascara and crying directly into the camera. The caption across the bottom of the screen read, "Surviving a toxic family member." Guys, I am literally shaking right now. Brittany whimpered to her 300,000 followers. My sister Caroline just had a complete psychotic break at our family barbecue. She was completely out of her mind on something, and she attacked my dad. He had to physically restrain her to protect me. I am just so traumatized that someone sharing my blood could be this dangerous. Please send prayers for my family. I looked at the view count, 2.5 million views. Thousands of comments were pouring in, calling me a monster and praising Brittany for her bravery. She had even tagged the private equity firm where I worked in the comments section. It was the ultimate narcissistic spin. She was using my shattered face for engagement farming. Ethan reached to turn the phone off, but I stopped him. "Leave it up," I said flatly. "Let her commit character assassination in front of millions of people. It will make the defamation suit that much more lucrative." Ethan nodded and walked over to his home office setup. As an estate planning attorney, he spent his days tracking hidden assets and untangling complex financial webs. He opened his laptop and booted up his firm's secure database. "I am pulling a full comprehensive background check on your entire family right now," Ethan said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "If Richard wants to play dirty with your board of directors, we need to lock down every single one of your assets. I am running your social security number to make sure your father has not tried to attach your name to his failing commercial loans." I walked over and stood behind his chair. The painkillers were making my head fuzzy, but my forensic accountant instincts were razor sharp. I watched the screen as Ethan pulled my official credit report. The blue loading bar swept across the screen and a list of accounts populated. Ethan stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor. He blinked twice as if adjusting to a glaring error in the code. "Caroline," Ethan said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual calm demeanor. "Why are there 5 Amex Black cards and a $200,000 business loan registered to your social security number, routed to Brittany's address?" The air in the room grew ice cold. I leaned over his shoulder and stared at the lines of financial data. There it was in black and white, a massive line of credit opened 4 years ago. The exact same year Brittany suddenly quit her receptionist job and rebranded herself as a luxury lifestyle influencer. "Pull the statement history," I commanded. Ethan clicked into the file. Page after page of exorbitant charges flooded the screen. First-class flights to Dubai, $10,000 shopping sprees at Chanel, $5,000 tabs at exclusive Manhattan nightclubs. Monthly minimum payments were barely being met, and the interest was compounding at a staggering rate. The total debt sat at exactly $250,000. "She stole my identity," I whispered, piecing the timeline together. 4 years ago, I was hospitalized with a severe viral infection. Mom and Dad came to my apartment to get my mail and my medical paperwork. They had my social security card. They gave it to Brittany. Ethan looked at me with pure disbelief. Her entire influencer aesthetic. The bags, the cars, the vacations. None of it was paid for by your father. She has been funding her fake rich life by destroying your credit score. "We need to call the fraud department at American Express right now," Ethan said, reaching for his phone. "We can freeze these accounts instantly. She will be locked out before morning." I placed my hand over his phone and slowly pushed it down to the desk. The throbbing in my face faded, completely replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Freezing the cards was a slap on the wrist. It would stop the spending, but it would not deliver the absolute devastation my family had earned today. They thought they could violently assault me and steal $250,000 under my name without consequences. They thought my success was simply a disposable asset for the golden child to drain. "Do not freeze the cards," I said, grabbing my own phone from the kitchen counter. "If we call the bank, they will just close the accounts and write it off." "I do not want a write-off, Ethan. I want federal prison." I bypassed the bank completely and scrolled through my contacts until I found Jasmine's number. My sister-in-law answered on the second ring, despite the late hour. She sounded exhausted but alert. "Jasmine," I said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. "I know you are furious about what Richard did at the barbecue, but we have a much bigger problem." "What is it, Caroline?" Jasmine asked the prosecutor, in her voice taking over. "I need to report a $250,000 wire fraud across state lines," I said, staring at the list of extravagant charges on the computer screen. "Brittany stole my identity to fund her influencer lifestyle. She is currently holding 5 fraudulent credit cards and a fake business loan. I do not want local police involved. Let us make it federal." I could practically hear Jasmine sitting up straight in her bed. The silence on the line was heavy with anticipation. "Send me the files," Jasmine said, her voice sharp and focused. "I will draft the federal indictment myself. By the time Brittany wakes up tomorrow to go shopping, her entire world is going to collapse." I hit export on the financial records and sent them directly to the federal prosecutor's encrypted email. The trap was officially set. My sister had no idea that her next swipe of that stolen plastic would trigger an alarm she could never undo. The polished marble lobby of Vanguard Holdings echoed with a shrill, piercing shriek. It was Tuesday afternoon, barely 48 hours after my father cracked my skull open. I was standing in front of the glass security turnstiles alongside Ethan. My cheek was heavily bandaged, but my posture was completely straight. A few feet away, Brittany was throwing a massive temper tantrum. She was wearing a tweed Chanel jacket and carrying a Birkin bag that my stolen credit score had paid for. A crowd of Manhattan private equity directors, investment bankers, and corporate lawyers had stopped to watch the spectacle. "Call her down here right now," Brittany screamed at the bewildered security guard. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand against the reception desk. "She is my sister. Tell Caroline to get her ugly face down here and fix my credit cards before I have you all fired." I stepped forward. The heels of my shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor. "I am right here, Brittany," I said, my voice carrying cleanly across the vast lobby. "And no one is getting fired today. Except maybe your personal shopper." Brittany spun around. Her eyes were bloodshot and wild with panic. She marched straight up to me and jabbed a finger toward my chest. "Unlock the American Express cards right now," Brittany demanded, her voice shaking with arrogant rage. I was just at the Cartier boutique on Fifth Avenue. I tried to buy a watch and the machine declined it. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? The sales associate looked at me like I was some kind of poor person. "You called the bank and froze my accounts." Ethan stood beside me with his arms crossed. His eyes locked onto Brittany with absolute disgust. "Those are not your accounts," Brittany Ethan stated calmly. "They are registered to Caroline's social security number. You have been committing identity theft for 4 years." Brittany scoffed loudly and waved her hands in the air. She completely ignored the dozens of high-powered executives watching her every move. "Oh, please do not use big legal words with me, Ethan," Brittany snapped. "This is family money. Mom and Dad said Caroline owes me. I am the face of this family. I have an image to maintain online. Caroline makes plenty of money pushing papers around in this boring building. She can afford to cover my lifestyle. Family protects family, Caroline. You owe me for completely ruining my Labor Day barbecue." I stared at the woman I had shared a childhood bathroom with. She genuinely believed her own twisted delusions. My parents had spent 3 decades feeding her ego and shielding her from reality. Now, standing in the heart of corporate Manhattan, her manufactured reality was colliding with the real world. "Oh, you?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly quiet and incredibly precise. "Like how I owed you my sweet 16 presents that you stole and pawned for cash. Like how I owed you the car I bought with my own waitressing money, the one you totaled while driving drunk and leaving me to pay the insurance deductible." Brittany rolled her eyes and crossed her arms defensively. "That was years ago. Get over it." "I got over it," I replied smoothly. "But I am not getting over $250,000 in fraudulent charges. You opened 5 black cards and took out a massive business loan to fund your fake influencer life. That was not your money, Brittany. That was federal bank fraud." "You are just jealous," Brittany shrieked, stomping her foot like a toddler. "You have always been jealous of my beauty and my followers. Dad was right to smash that brick into your face. You are a vindictive monster. Now pick up your phone, call the bank, and authorize the purchase for the Rolex. I have a brand deal photo shoot in 2 hours and I need that watch." The sheer audacity of her demand made a few of the nearby executives gasp out loud. She had just publicly admitted that our father assaulted me and demanded a luxury watch in the exact same breath. "I did not freeze the cards, Brittany," I said softly, taking a step closer. "I reported the accounts to the Federal Fraud Department last night. I warned them that the thief would likely try to make a large panic purchase once they realized the money train was ending. The bank system flagged your transaction at the boutique automatically." Brittany's face contorted in confusion. Before she could open her mouth to scream again, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. Two uniformed New York Police Department officers walked into the building, their hands rested firmly on their utility belts. They bypassed the security desk entirely and walked straight toward our group. Brittany saw the police and immediately plastered a smug, triumphant smile onto her face. She pointed a dramatic finger right at me. Finally, Brittany yelled, turning toward the officers. "Officers, arrest this woman! My sister is mentally unstable. She is withholding my money and she is threatening me. My father is a very important man in Connecticut, and he will reward you for locking her up." The lead officer did not even look at me. He stopped directly in front of Brittany and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Brittany Williams," the officer asked, his voice booming through the silent lobby. "Yes," Brittany said proudly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "That is me. You are under arrest for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and attempting to purchase a $15,000 Rolex using a stolen credit profile 20 minutes ago," the officer stated loudly. He grabbed her arm, spun her around, and snapped the handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed off the marble walls. Brittany shrieked in absolute terror. She thrashed against the officers and dropped her stolen Birkin bag onto the floor. "Let go of me! Do you know who my father is? Caroline. Tell them to stop. Tell them you gave me permission," Brittany wailed as the officers dragged her toward the exit. I stood perfectly still and watched her struggle. The lobby remained dead silent except for her frantic screams. "I am just a jealous, vindictive monster," I called out to her as she was hauled through the glass doors. "Remember." Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket as the police cruiser sirens wailed to life outside on the busy Manhattan street. He looked at me with a sharp, victorious smile. "Well," Ethan said smoothly, "that takes care of the identity thief. Are you ready to deal with the man who funded her?" Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office at Vanguard Holdings. We had come straight to work the morning after Brittany's very public arrest. My cheek was still throbbing beneath the stark white bandage, but my mind had never been clearer. On my mahogany desk sat a towering stack of financial reports. Ethan had spent the entire night tracking every single wire transfer that went in and out of my father's failing logistics company. As an estate planning attorney, Ethan knew exactly how to hunt down buried assets and hidden liabilities. Richard's regional logistics firm was bleeding cash. For years, he had maintained his lavish Greenwich lifestyle by shuffling debt from one ledger to another. But he was completely out of ledgers, and he had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the pen. The red light on my secure desk phone began blinking furiously. Only a handful of people had the direct line to my office. I glanced at the caller ID. It was the landline from the Greenwich estate. I reached forward and pressed the speaker button. "Caroline," my father barked. His voice was thick with unearned confidence and dripping with absolute venom. "You really thought you could outsmart me. You thought you could send those badge-wearing thugs to embarrass my daughter and get away with it." I leaned back in my leather chair and caught Ethan's eye. "Good morning to you too, Richard. I assume Brittany did not enjoy her night in a downtown holding cell." "Brittany is home safe and sound in her own bed," Richard stated proudly. "You see, Caroline, money solves everything in the real world. You can play big-shot corporate director all you want, but real power lies in connections. Those state troopers your little lawyer boyfriend called, I made 3 phone calls this morning. The assault charges against me are stalled indefinitely. The local chief knows exactly who sponsors the police union's annual charity gala. You are not putting me in handcuffs." He did not stop to breathe. He was riding a high of arrogant delusion, completely blind to the trap he had already stepped into. "But you are going to pay dearly for the stunt you pulled yesterday," Richard threatened. "Brittany lost 3 major brand sponsorships because of that public arrest. Her influencer career is severely damaged. I am filing a massive civil suit against you for defamation and emotional distress. I will drag your name through the mud. I will call your board members every single day until Vanguard Holdings fires you just to escape the bad press." I stared at the digital display on my console. The screen clearly indicated that 2 separate extensions were active on the call. He was calling from his heavy oak desk in the home office, but someone else had quietly picked up the kitchen phone. My mother. Patricia lived for eavesdropping. She thrived on gathering gossip to weaponize later. Today she was going to get a front row seat to her own tragedy. I let out a sharp, bright laugh that echoed against the glass walls of my office. Sue me for defamation. To be defamed, you need a good reputation to begin with. Tell me, Richard, how exactly did you post bail this morning? Because I know for a fact your personal accounts are completely overdrawn. I have plenty of liquid capital, he stammered defensively. You just drained your employee's payroll to cover a $250,000 bail bond. I said, my voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. You literally stole the paychecks from the truck drivers, the forklift operators, and the warehouse workers who keep your failing business afloat. Tomorrow is Friday. Hundreds of hardworking people are going to check their bank accounts and find nothing because their boss decided to use their rent money to bail out a spoiled identity thief. I did not give him a chance to deny it. I leaned closer to the speaker, ensuring every word carried absolute clarity. But then again, stealing from the people who trust you is your signature move, is it not? The same way you drained Mom's retirement to pay off your secret mistresses in 2018. The line went completely dead. For 2 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but static. Then a sharp, ragged gasp ripped through the speaker. It was loud and filled with absolute horror. It came directly from the kitchen extension. Richard Patricia's voice trembled. It sounded brittle and completely broken. What is she talking about? What mistresses? Where is my retirement money? Patricia, hang up the phone right now. Richard roared, his fake confidence completely shattering. She is lying. Caroline is just trying to tear our family apart because she is jealous. Ask him to log into his bank portal. Mom, I said smoothly, ignoring his shouting. Ask him to show you the wire transfers to that luxury condo in Boca Raton. The one he bought for a 25-year-old receptionist while you were recovering from your 3rd facelift. Shut your mouth! Caroline, Richard screamed. The sound of heavy wood crashing against the floor echoed through the phone as if he had flipped his desk chair in a blind rage. I will ruin you. I will destroy your entire life. I picked up a sleek black fountain pen from my desk and signed my name at the bottom of the thick legal document resting on my blotter. Ethan smiled and slid the paper into a leather folder. You cannot destroy someone who holds your leash, I replied, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Oh, and Richard, since you missed the mortgage payment on your warehouse to pay that bail, I just signed the eviction notice. I pressed the glowing red button to disconnect the call, leaving my parents to tear each other apart in their massive hollow mansion. Their entire kingdom of lies was burning to the ground, and they had handed me the matches. I looked up at Ethan, who was already dialing our internal legal department to dispatch the recovery team. The United States Marshals were going to padlock Richard's warehouse doors in exactly 1 hour, and there was absolutely no amount of country club influence that could stop them. 2 weeks had passed since the United States Marshals padlocked the heavy iron gates of Richard's logistics warehouse. Instead of retreating in shame or facing the reality of their utter financial devastation, my parents doubled down on their delusions. They proceeded with their lavish 35th anniversary gala at the Greenwich Country Club. They needed to project absolute financial invulnerability to their high society peers. They were desperate to prove that the rumors swirling around their crumbling empire were nothing more than jealous gossip. The grand ballroom of the country club was draped in imported white orchids and dripping with massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circled the room, balancing silver platters of caviar and vintage champagne. Richard stood near a towering swan ice sculpture, laughing loudly with the local police chief and the club president. Patricia was holding court by the string quartet. I could hear her sharp voice cutting through the classical music as I stood just outside the grand mahogany double doors. Brittany is just taking a gap year to travel through Europe. Patricia lied smoothly to a group of wealthy country club wives who were practically hanging on her every word. She needed a break from the spotlight. and Caroline is away on a prolonged corporate retreat. You know how demanding her little accounting job can be. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The brass handles yielded easily to my touch. I was wearing a stunning floor-length emerald silk gown that Ethan had picked out for me. I wore my hair pulled back tightly into a sleek chignon, intentionally leaving the angry red jagged scar on my left cheekbone and forehead completely exposed. The stitches had been removed, but the healing wound was stark and highly visible. I had refused plastic surgery, and I refused to hide it behind heavy makeup. I wanted the elite of Greenwich to see exactly what Richard Wilson was capable of behind closed doors. Jasmine and Michael walked into the ballroom right behind me. Michael stood taller than I had ever seen him. He had finally stepped out of our father's shadow, shedding the years of toxic control. Jasmine wore a sharp, tailored designer blazer and radiated the terrifying authority of a federal tax prosecutor who had just finished building an airtight case. Ethan flanked my right side, offering a steadying, unyielding presence as the murmurs began to ripple through the packed ballroom. Heads turned instantly. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet missed a beat as the elite crowd of Greenwich stared at my unhidden facial trauma. Patricia saw me, and the color drained entirely from her perfectly powdered face. She abandoned her audience of gossiping wives and practically sprinted across the polished marble floor to intercept us before we could reach the center of the room. Patricia grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. She tried to drag me toward the secluded coat check room, but I stood my ground like a marble statue. "What are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper. She glared at my face with absolute revulsion. "Cover that hideous scar. You are ruining our image. We told everyone you were out of the country." I gently peeled my mother's trembling fingers off my arm. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, Jasmine stepped up. She smoothed the lapels of her designer blazer and looked down at my mother with icy precision. "The only thing ruining your image?" Patricia Jasmine stated, her voice carrying clearly over the hushed whispers of the surrounding guests, "is the fact that your husband's logistics company has not paid federal taxes in 4 years." Patricia gasped loudly and took a stumbling step back, bumping directly into Michael. She looked up at her oldest son, her eyes wide with panic, expecting him to defend her honor. Michael simply shook his head and looked at her with deep disappointment. "It is over, Mom," Michael said firmly. "Jasmine showed me the books. Dad has been committing massive tax evasion to fund this fake lifestyle and pay off his mistresses. He drained his employees' payroll accounts just to bail Brittany out of jail. I am completely cutting ties with this family." Across the room, Richard noticed the commotion. He excused himself from the club president Arthur Vance and marched angrily toward our group. His face was flushed deep red with alcohol and rising fury. "Security!" Richard bellowed, waving his heavy hand toward the lobby guard standing near the entrance. "Remove these people immediately. They are trespassing on a private event and harassing my wife." Arthur Vance, the club president, followed Richard, looking deeply concerned by the sudden outburst. "Richard, is there a problem here?" Arthur asked, eyeing my facial scar and the tense standoff between our family members. "No problem at all, Arthur," Richard lied smoothly, flashing a fake, desperate grin. "Just a minor family misunderstanding. My daughter has been struggling with some mental health issues. We are handling it internally." Suddenly, a young man dressed in the crisp white uniform of the country club catering staff approached Richard. He was carrying a silver serving tray holding a single crystal flute of champagne. "Champagne, sir?" the waiter asked, keeping his head respectfully bowed. Richard scoffed and reached for the glass. "About time." The waiter deftly pulled the glass away. With his other hand, he produced a thick, heavy stack of legal documents tied with a thick rubber band from beneath the silver tray. He slapped the stack directly against Richard's chest, forcing my father to grab the papers reflexively before they hit the floor. "Richard Wilson, you have been served," the young man announced, his voice booming clearly over the sudden absolute silence in the grand ballroom. "I am a process server with the state of Connecticut. Those are the formal foreclosure documents and the immediate seizure order for all your corporate and personal assets. And per the instructions of the federal court, this seizure includes the immediate revocation of your country club membership. The heavy stack of legal documents hit the marble floor with a resounding slap. The thick rubber band snapped and dozens of pages spilled across the polished stone right at Arthur Vance's expensive leather shoes. The club president stared down at the bold federal headers. He took 2 swift steps backward, completely distancing himself from Richard. The string quartet had completely stopped playing. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. Every high society gaze was locked on my father. Patricia let out a high, piercing shriek. She lunged forward and tried to gather the papers as if hiding them would somehow reverse the federal order. Richard stood frozen. His jaw worked silently, but no words came out. The process server simply nodded, tipped his head toward me, and melted back into the crowd of stunned caterers. Michael grabbed my elbow. His grip was tight and his face was pale with panic. He pulled me away from Ethan and Jasmine, dragging me toward the edge of the dance floor near the towering floral arrangements. "Caroline, stop this right now," Michael pleaded. His voice was a frantic whisper. "You have made your point. You humiliated them in front of everyone they care about. But you have to call off the marshals. They are our parents, Caroline. You are completely destroying them over a brick." I stared at my older brother. He had spent his entire life playing the peacekeeper. He always smoothed over Richard's explosive temper and Patricia's calculated cruelty. He honestly believed that keeping his head down would protect him. "I did not destroy them, Michael." I stated, my voice deadly calm. "They destroyed themselves. I am just the one holding the mirror." "You are going to leave them homeless," Michael hissed, running a hand through his hair. "Dad will go to prison. Mom will have absolutely nothing. Family protects family, Caroline. You cannot send federal agents to seize everything they own." I felt a sharp presence step up beside me. Jasmine had followed us across the room. Her dark eyes were blazing with a fury I had never seen before. She stood between me and her husband, adjusting her tailored blazer with sharp, precise movements. "Are you actually defending them right now?" Jasmine demanded. Her voice cut through the air like a whip. "Are you defending the man who smashed a masonry brick into your sister's face and left her bleeding on the floor?" "Jasmine." "Please," Michael begged, holding his hands up defensively. "I am just trying to stop our family from completely imploding." "Your family imploded years ago," Jasmine snapped, stepping closer to him. "And if you say one more word defending that monster, I will walk out of these mahogany doors, pack my bags, and leave you tonight. That is a promise, Michael." Michael stared at his wife in absolute shock. He had never heard her issue an ultimatum. Jasmine was a composed and calculated tax prosecutor. She did not make empty threats. Jasmine pulled a sleek leather portfolio from her oversized designer tote bag. She unzipped it and yanked out a thick file folder marked with red federal audit tags. "Open your eyes," Jasmine commanded, shoving the file hard against his chest. Richard did not just smash her face. "Look at these ledgers. Look at the loan origination documents." Michael reluctantly opened the folder. His eyes scanned the highlighted sections. I watched his expression shift from confusion to absolute horror. "What is this?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. "These are commercial real estate loans for the Greenwich warehouse. But my name is listed as the primary guarantor. Your father forged your signature." Jasmine stated, her tone dripping with professional disgust. "He forged your signature as a co-signer on 4 separate failing business loans over the past 3 years. He used your pristine credit score to borrow millions of dollars to keep his sinking logistics company afloat." Michael shook his head rapidly in denial. "Dad would never do that. That is federal bank fraud." "He did exactly that," Jasmine countered, leaning in close. "Caroline found the discrepancies during her audit and brought them straight to my office. We spent the entire night tracing the funds. Richard took those fraudulent loans and wired the money directly into Brittany's personal checking accounts to fund her designer lifestyle and pay off her identity theft debts." Michael stared at the pages in his hands. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking physically ill. If Caroline did not seize the company today, the bank was going to default the loans by next Friday. Jasmine continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Do you know what happens when those loans default, Michael? The IRS and the federal creditors do not go after your bankrupt father. They go after the guarantor. They would seize our savings. They would garnish your wages. They would seize our house. Michael stood entirely paralyzed. The lifelong illusion of his loving father shattered into a million jagged pieces. He looked across the ballroom. Richard was currently shouting at a security guard, while Patricia openly wept on the floor, trying to gather the spilled foreclosure notices. You stole my future to fund Brittany's fake life, Michael whispered. His voice carried across the silent room, reaching Richard's ears. Richard snapped his head toward us. Michael's son, listen to me, Richard called out, plastering on a fake, desperate smile. I can explain everything. It was just a temporary cash flow issue. I was going to pay it all back before you even noticed. Michael did not say a single word to his father. He simply turned his back on the man, completely shutting him out. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number with shaking but determined fingers. David, it is, Michael, he said, speaking to his personal attorney. I need you to draft an emergency injunction. I am joining Caroline's civil lawsuit against my father. I want him charged with aggravated identity theft and federal bank fraud. Call the district attorney immediately. Michael ended the call and stood firmly next to Jasmine. He looked at me, and for the first time in our entire lives, he was not asking me to surrender. He was standing on my side of the battlefield. Let it all burn, Caroline, Michael said quietly. Take every last penny. The morning sun offered absolutely no warmth to the Greenwich estate. The sprawling mansion felt more like a tomb. Less than 12 hours had passed since Michael looked our father in the eye and publicly promised to help me burn his empire to the ground. Richard was backed into a corner. The federal marshals had his warehouse. The IRS was targeting his personal assets. Michael and Jasmine were unleashing a legal firestorm over the forged loan documents. Richard had exactly one lifeline left. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it immediately. At precisely 9 in the morning, Richard shoved through the heavy glass doors of First Greenwich Financial. Brittany trailed closely behind him, wearing oversized dark sunglasses indoors and a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her head. She was desperately trying to hide from imaginary paparazzi, convinced that her public arrest and the country club disaster had made her the prime target of global tabloid media. In reality, she was just a disgraced local scammer, but her delusion remained fully intact. They bypassed the teller lines and marched directly toward the executive wealth management offices. Richard was sweating through his custom-tailored suit. His face was a blotchy, unhinged shade of crimson. He demanded the private conference room and ordered the receptionist to summon the senior bank manager immediately. The executive conference room was a sterile sanctuary of frosted glass and cold gray marble. Richard paced the length of the long table, checking his gold watch every 10 seconds. Brittany slumped into a leather chair and crossed her arms, pulling her designer tote bag onto her lap. You need to make them hurry up, Dad, Brittany whined, pulling her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. My crisis public relations team needs a $50,000 retainer by noon, or they are dropping me as a client. I cannot rebuild my influencer brand if my own lawyer boyfriend dumped me and my sister is trying to ruin my life. I need my trust fund cleared today. I have suffered enough. Do not worry about the money, Brittany, Richard snapped, rubbing his temples frantically. The generational trust unlocks today. $3 million sitting in high-yield accounts. It is entirely untouchable by my corporate creditors. We transfer the funds to an offshore account this morning, pay your legal fees, and hire the best defense team in the state to crush Caroline. I am still the head of this family. I still have the power. The frosted glass door clicked open. Mr. Sterling, the senior branch manager, stepped into the room. He was a tall, impeccably groomed man in his late 50s. He carried a single thin manila folder rather than the thick stack of transfer authorizations Richard was expecting. Mr. Sterling did not offer a polite smile. He did not extend his hand for a greeting. He simply walked to the opposite end of the marble table and stood perfectly still. Sterling, Where are the transfer documents? Richard barked, slamming his hand flat against the tabletop. I called your office at 7 this morning. My daughter needs her trust fund liquidated and wired to our secondary accounts immediately. Do not make me pull my assets from this bank. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked at Richard with a gaze devoid of any professional warmth. I'm afraid that will not be possible, Richard. There are no transfer documents for you to sign today. What are you talking about? Brittany shrieked, sitting up straight and dropping her expensive bag onto the floor. That is my grandfather's money. He set that up for me. I am 30 years old now, and the terms clearly state the money is mine. Transfer it right now, or my father will have you fired. Richard stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure aggressive entitlement. He slammed his fist onto the marble table again, rattling the glass water pitchers. Stop playing games with me, Sterling! Richard roared, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. Give my daughter her money. I am the legal executor of my father's estate. I have the absolute authority to disperse these funds, and I am ordering you to release the $3 million right now. Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He opened the thin manila folder and looked down at the single sheet of paper inside. You were the executor, Richard. Mr. Sterling stated, his voice dropping to a low, icy register. You held that position right up until your father discovered you were embezzling from it. The air vanished from the room. Richard froze mid-breath. His raised hand slowly lowered to his side. The aggressive red flush in his cheeks instantly drained away, leaving him a pale, sickly white. That is impossible, Richard stammered, his voice suddenly sounding very small and incredibly fragile. He did not know. He passed away before the audit. He knew everything, Mr. Sterling corrected sharply. Arthur Sr. came into this exact office 5 years ago. He sat in that exact chair. He showed me the unauthorized withdrawals you made to cover the early losses of your logistics company. You stole from your own children to fund your failing business. Your father was entirely devastated by your greed. He revoked your status as executor the very next morning. You have absolutely no authority over this trust, and you never will again. Brittany looked back and forth between the bank manager and her father, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. Dad, what is he talking about? She demanded, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. Where is my $3 million? Who has my money? Before Richard could even attempt to formulate a lie, the heavy oak and frosted glass door swung wide open. The sharp click of my heels echoed perfectly across the marble floor. I walked into the conference room wearing a sharp charcoal business suit, my posture impeccably straight. Ethan walked right beside me, carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked completely in his element, radiating the calm, devastating authority of a man about to deliver the final killing blow. Brittany gasped and shrank back into her chair. Richard stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost. His eyes darted frantically from me to Ethan and then to the bank manager. Ethan smiled. It was a sharp, brilliant expression that offered absolutely zero mercy. He set his briefcase on the table and unlatched the brass locks with a satisfying click. As the new estate administrator, Ethan announced, his voice ringing with absolute legal finality. I can confirm that the terms of the trust were permanently altered. Arthur Sr. wanted to ensure his legacy was protected from thieves and frauds. Therefore, he removed Richard as executor and completely removed Brittany as a beneficiary. Caroline was made the sole beneficiary and trustee of this account 5 years ago. Every single penny belongs to her. The reality of the frozen trust fund sent Brittany into an immediate and absolute tailspin. With Richard facing a federal indictment and Patricia completely stripped of her high society standing, Brittany was entirely on her own. She had exactly 3 days to secure a $50,000 retainer for a prominent criminal defense attorney, or the state prosecutors were going to process her felony identity theft charges without a plea deal. Federal prison was no longer a vague threat or a minor inconvenience she could cry her way out of. It was a rapidly approaching reality. That evening, Brittany resorted to the only survival tactic she had ever successfully mastered. She poured herself into a skin-tight crimson silk dress, applied a flawless layer of expensive makeup she had bought with my stolen credit cards, and ordered a premium ride service to the Oak Room. The ultra-exclusive lounge was an infamous hunting ground for Greenwich and Manhattan elite. It was the exact place where venture capitalists and hedge fund managers went to spend their astronomical bonuses. Brittany needed a savior, and she needed one tonight. She scanned the dimly lit mahogany and leather room until she found her target. Julian Mercer was sitting alone in a velvet corner booth nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch. He was a billionaire tech investor known for funding disruptive software startups and living a notoriously lavish lifestyle. He was also exactly the kind of man Brittany believed she could effortlessly manipulate with a few batted eyelashes and a tragic story. She glided across the room, making sure the split in her designer dress caught the dim lighting. She slid into the booth opposite Julian uninvited, but armed with a practiced, perfectly vulnerable smile. Within 10 minutes, she was tracing the rim of a crystal champagne flute and spinning a masterful web of lies. She told Julian that her family was going through a temporary liquidity issue due to a massive international corporate merger. She sighed delicately, claiming her personal bank accounts were frozen due to a mundane clerical error, and she just needed a strong, successful man to help her bridge the gap until her lawyers sorted it out. Julian listened intently. He did not question her ridiculous story about international mergers. He ordered another bottle of vintage champagne and leaned in close, hanging on her every word. He played the role of the captivated, wealthy benefactor flawlessly. "You are clearly a woman who deserves to be taken care of, Brittany," Julian murmured smoothly, resting his hand briefly over hers. "I am hosting a private VIP business dinner tomorrow night at Le Bernardin in the city. It is an intimate gathering of my top partners and investors. Come as my personal guest. We can discuss your temporary financial hiccup over a proper meal. I am sure I can make your legal problems disappear." Brittany beamed. She practically vibrated with triumphant relief. She had done it. She had secured a billionaire sugar daddy in less than an hour. She spent her last $200 on a blowout the next afternoon, convinced that she was about to walk out of that dinner with a blank check and a brand new life. The private dining room at Le Bernardin was a masterpiece of understated luxury. When Brittany arrived the following evening, she was floating on a cloud of unearned arrogance. She strutted into the room dripping in stolen diamonds and took the seat of honor directly to Julian's right. The long table was surrounded by a dozen high-powered executives. Brittany immediately began holding court. She leaned back in her plush chair, sipping an immensely expensive Cabernet, and decided to lay the groundwork for her victim narrative. She needed these powerful men to view her as a tragic heroine who was simply misunderstood by the justice system. "It has been such a stressful week," Brittany sighed dramatically, waving her manicured hand. "My family is dealing with a massive crisis. My older sister had a complete mental breakdown. She froze all of our assets and called the police on me over a simple misunderstanding about a credit card. It is entirely pathetic." One of the executives across the table raised an eyebrow, looking deeply concerned. "That sounds incredibly vindictive. Why would she do something like that?" Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes and taking another large gulp of wine. "My sister is just a jealous, ugly accountant. I'm the face of the family." She leaned forward, making sure the entire table was listening. "She has spent her entire life hiding in a cubicle while I built a massive online brand. I am the one who brings in the sponsorships and maintains our social standing. Caroline is just bitter that no one has ever looked twice at her. She is trying to destroy me out of pure spite, but thankfully I have people like Julian to protect me from her delusions." Julian nodded sympathetically. He signaled the waiter to refill Brittany's glass. He smiled a sharp, predatory smile that Brittany completely mistook for affection and infatuation. "It is truly remarkable how much damage a single person can do," Julian agreed smoothly. "In fact, we were just discussing the importance of having the right people protecting your assets. In my line of work, a single miscalculation can cost millions. You need someone with absolute precision to manage the risks." Brittany leaned closer to him, resting her hand on his tailored sleeve. Well, you will not have to worry about risks with me, Julian. I only bring rewards. Julian gently patted her hand before standing up. He picked up his crystal water glass and tapped it lightly with a silver spoon. The gentle ringing sound brought the entire room to an immediate respectful silence. Thank you all for joining me tonight, Julian began, his voice projecting effortless authority. As you know, my firm navigated a highly volatile market last quarter. We faced multiple corporate restructuring challenges and aggressive hostile takeovers, but we emerged more profitable than ever. I did not do that alone. I want to take a moment to honor the architect of our current success. Brittany smiled, assuming this was just a boring corporate prelude to handing her a check. She took another sip of wine, completely oblivious to the shifting energy in the room. I'd like to introduce the genius who saved my firm $50 million last quarter, Julian announced, turning toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the private room. My chief risk consultant, Caroline. The heavy oak doors swung open. I stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent antechamber. I was wearing a sharp-tailored black suit. My hair was pulled back and the healing scar on my cheek was fully visible. I walked slowly to the head of the table, stopping directly across from Brittany. Brittany choked on her wine. She slammed her crystal glass down, coughing violently as her eyes widened in absolute terror. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. She looked at Julian and then back to me, her mind violently struggling to process the reality of the room. Julian did not meet you at a bar by accident, Brittany. I stated, my voice deadly calm and echoing clearly through the silent dining room. He is the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. He is my boss. Brittany shrank back into her chair. The luxurious walls of the private dining room suddenly became the bars of a very expensive cage. The trap had snapped shut and she finally realized she was entirely out of moves. Word of Brittany's absolute humiliation at Le Bernardin spread through the financial district before the dessert plates were even cleared. Julian's security team had escorted her out of the building, leaving her to face the cold Manhattan night with nothing but her stolen diamonds and her ruined reputation. The walls were rapidly closing in on the Wilson family. Patricia saw the writing on the wall. She knew the federal marshals were auditing everything. The $3 million trust was legally mine. Richard's business was permanently seized. There was no secret offshore account to save them. The ship was sinking and Patricia was desperately searching for a lifeboat. Less than 48 hours after the restaurant incident, I received a text message from an unknown number. It was Patricia. She demanded a private meeting. She insisted on total secrecy, choosing a location so far beneath her usual high society standards that it confirmed her absolute panic. She chose a rundown 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of Stamford, a place where nobody from Greenwich would ever be caught dead. The diner smelled of stale fry grease and cheap bleach. I walked through the heavy glass double doors wearing a tailored navy power suit and carrying a simple leather briefcase. The scar on my face was a stark, undeniable badge of survival. I found Patricia sitting in a cracked red vinyl booth at the very back of the restaurant. She looked entirely out of place in her Chanel trench coat, nervously wiping down the sticky laminate table with a dry paper napkin. The dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion despite the heavy layer of expensive foundation she had applied. She looked up as I slid into the booth across from her. She tried to offer a warm maternal smile, but it twisted into a grotesque, desperate grimace. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not apologize for my injuries. She went straight to business. "Richard is completely ruined," Patricia stated, her voice stripped of its usual haughty resonance. She pulled her designer coat tighter around her shoulders. "The federal prosecutors are officially moving forward with the indictment today. Brittany's lawyers are demanding a massive cash retainer we simply do not have. The country club board is voting to revoke our membership tomorrow afternoon. Everything is gone, Caroline." I signaled the waitress for a black coffee and looked at my mother with absolute detachment. "That sounds like a spectacular list of consequences, Patricia. Why exactly did you drag me out here to tell me things I already know?" Patricia leaned forward, casting a paranoid glance around the empty diner. "Because I have something you want," she whispered, lowering her voice. "I have the keys to the kingdom. Richard thinks he can outsmart the federal auditors, but he is careless. I kept copies of everything. The offshore wire transfers, the falsified payroll records, the forged bank loans he took out in Michael's name. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. She placed it squarely in the middle of the sticky table, keeping her manicured hand firmly pressed over it. "I am offering you a deal," Patricia said, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory gleam. "I will turn state's evidence. I will formally testify against Richard for the tax fraud and the bank loans. I will stand up in federal court and swear under oath that I saw him commit physical assault against you. And I will testify against Brittany. I will hand the prosecutors all the proof they need to lock her away for identity theft." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was willing to send her husband and her golden child to federal prison without a single second thought. She was throwing them to the wolves to save her own skin. "And what exactly is your price for this sudden burst of maternal honesty?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure disgust. Patricia did not even flinch. She sat up straighter, adjusting her silk scarf. "I want a luxury condo in the city paid in cash, fully in my name. And I want you to pay my Greenwich Country Club dues for the next 10 years. You control the $3 million trust now. You have Julian Mercer's ear. You can easily afford this. I give you the final nails for their coffins, and you guarantee my lifestyle remains intact." I sat back against the cracked vinyl booth. I looked at the terrible jagged scar reflected in the diner window, and then looked back at my mother. "You watched Dad crack my skull open and you laughed. Now you want me to buy you a condo to testify?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly calm register. Patricia picked up her thick ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of her cheap diner coffee. She looked at me over the rim with absolute chilling indifference. "Survival of the fittest, darling." "I always knew you were the smart one," Patricia replied, setting the mug down. "Richard and Brittany are sinking ships. I refuse to drown with them. Do we have a deal or not?" I looked down at the silver flash drive resting on the table. Then I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I placed it on the table right next to her hand. The screen was brightly lit, showing an active group call that had been running for the past 14 minutes. Patricia frowned, looking down at the screen. She read the two names listed on the active call logs, Richard and Brittany. The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. Her mouth dropped open in mute horror as the realization hit her like a physical blow. She scrambled backward in the vinyl booth, trying to snatch the flash drive off the table. I slapped my hand down over hers, pinning it to the sticky laminate. "I do not need your testimony, Patricia," I stated, clearly leaning in so the microphone would pick up every single syllable. "I already gave the federal prosecutors everything they need. I did not come here to make a deal with you. I came here to let your husband and your golden child listen to you sell them out for a country club membership." I lifted my hand from the table, leaving Patricia trembling in absolute terror. I picked up my phone and looked directly into her panicked eyes. "Have a lovely trip back to your empty mansion, Mother," I said. "I am sure Richard and Brittany are waiting eagerly to greet you." I tapped the red button to end the active broadcast. I stood up from the booth, leaving the flash drive exactly where it was. I walked out of the diner, leaving my mother entirely alone in the suffocating silence, with zero allies, zero money, and absolutely nowhere left to hide. The live audio broadcast of Patricia negotiating her treacherous immunity deal had echoed through the speakers of Richard's smartphone like a death knell. Knowing his wife had just offered to hand the federal prosecutors the final nails for his coffin, Richard realized his time had completely run out. The federal marshals had already padlocked his primary warehouse. The IRS was actively circling his personal accounts. Michael and Jasmine were preparing a devastating civil suit for the forged guarantor signatures. Richard was cornered, a desperate rat backed against a concrete wall. He had exactly one play left, a secret scorched earth Hail Mary. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the executive boardroom of Wilson Logistics was thick with the smell of stale black coffee and palpable desperation. The massive mahogany table stretched across the room, overlooking the Greenwich shipping yards that Richard had controlled for 3 decades. Sitting across from him were 3 executives from Apex Dynamics, a rival logistics firm that had been trying to swallow Richard's territory for years. Marcus Thorne, The CEO of Apex sat with his hands steepled, staring at the desperate man across the table. Marcus knew Richard was bleeding out. He knew about the federal raids. He was here to pick the bones clean. Richard was sweating profusely through his bespoke suit. He shoved a thick stack of acquisition contracts across the polished mahogany. His hands were shaking, but his eyes burned with a manic, vindictive energy. He was offering to sell the entirety of Wilson Logistics, its client lists, remaining operational fleet, and vendor contracts for absolute pennies on the dollar. It was a total liquidation of his life's work. In exchange, Apex Dynamics would wire a $1 million golden parachute directly into an untraceable offshore account Richard had quietly set up in the Cayman Islands. He was planning to sign the papers, take the $1 million, and flee the country before the district attorney could freeze his passport. Just sign the bottom line, Marcus, Richard demanded, tapping his heavy gold pen against the contract. You get my entire market share in the tri-state area. I get the liquidity I need to handle a personal transition. We bypass the board of directors entirely through the emergency executive clause. It is the deal of the century, and you know it. Marcus smirked, picking up the contract. It is a fire sale, Richard. But yes, it is highly profitable for me. I just need to ensure the federal liens will not attach to the operational assets once we absorb the shell company. They will not. Richard lied smoothly, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. The shell is clean. Let the feds fight over the empty corporate accounts. Let my treacherous wife rot in the mansion she loves so much when the bank takes it. Richard turned to his two remaining loyalist board members, who sat silently at his side, looking entirely terrified by the illegal backroom dealing. She thinks she has me trapped, Richard sneered, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure spite. She thinks she can use federal auditors to orchestrate my downfall. Once this clears, my ungrateful daughter gets nothing. I built this empire with my own two hands. I will burn it to the ground and walk away rich before I ever let Caroline win. Marcus chuckled, pulling a silver pen from his breast pocket. He hovered the tip over the signature line, ready to officially transfer the assets and trigger the $1 million wire transfer. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom suddenly swung open with such violent force that they slammed against the interior walls. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Marcus dropped his pen. Richard bolted upright in his leather executive chair, his face draining of all color. I walked into the boardroom wearing a pristine ivory business suit, my posture radiating absolute unyielding authority. I was not alone. Flanking me were 4 senior executives from Vanguard Holdings, wearing sharp-tailored suits and carrying heavy legal briefcases. Behind them stood 2 massive private security contractors, their expressions carved from stone. Richard gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white. What is the meaning of this? Richard bellowed, his voice cracking with panic. Security! Get these trespassers out of my building immediately. We are in the middle of a closed-door corporate acquisition. I did not break my stride until I reached the head of the table. I looked down at the man who had tormented me my entire life. I looked at the golden parachute contracts spread across the wood. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. The acquisition is cancelled, I announced, my voice echoing with devastating finality. I took a massive, heavy, leather-bound binder from one of the Vanguard executives and dropped it squarely onto the center of the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a deafening thud, instantly scattering Richard's fraudulent contracts. Marcus Thorne stood up rapidly, backing away from the table. He recognized the Vanguard Holdings logo stamped on the front of the binder. Billionaires did not tangle with Vanguard. Marcus knew instantly that he had walked into a fatal trap. You cannot cancel this! Richard shouted, spittle flying from his lips as he pointed a trembling finger at my face. You have no authority here. I am the CEO. I own this company. I am selling the assets today. I placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, looking directly into his terrified, wide eyes. You cannot sell a company that has already been seized by Vanguard Holdings for defaulting on a $4 million mortgage. I stated my words, cutting through the air like frozen daggers. Richard gasped, clutching his chest. His loyalist board members scrambled backward, pushing their chairs away from the table to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. When you fraudulently forged Michael's signature on those commercial loans, you triggered a cross-default clause on the master mortgage for this entire facility, I explained, outlining his total destruction with surgical precision. Vanguard Holdings quietly bought up that toxic debt yesterday afternoon. You are in breach of every single financial covenant. We are not just taking the corporate accounts, Richard. We own the building. We own the trucks. We own the desk you are sitting at. I straightened my posture, smoothing the lapels of my ivory suit. I looked at the two private security contractors standing by the door and gave them a single sharp nod. Security, escort my father off my property. The two Vanguard security contractors did not gently escort my father out of the boardroom. They gripped him firmly by the biceps of his bespoke suit and practically lifted him off the polished mahogany floor. Richard kicked and thrashed, shouting a string of empty, profane threats, but the men dragged him out into the corridor with ruthless efficiency. Dozens of logistics employees stood up from their cubicles to watch the spectacle. The man who had ruled them through fear and intimidation for 3 decades was now being frog-marched through his own lobby like a common trespasser. The security contractors shoved him through the revolving glass doors and left him stumbling on the concrete pavement. Richard scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage and his chest heaving. He yanked his car keys from his pocket and ran toward his luxury sedan, parked in the executive space. As he slammed the car door shut and jammed his foot onto the accelerator, pure unadulterated panic finally set in. The company was gone. The $1 million golden parachute from Marcus Thorne was dead. Vanguard Holdings owned his entire operational fleet, and the commercial bank accounts were frozen solid. He was completely out of business moves. But Richard still had his ultimate contingency plan. Hidden behind a false panel in the master bedroom of his Greenwich estate was a heavy steel wall safe. It contained $500,000 in untraceable emergency cash, a stack of high-yield bearer bonds, and 2 secondary passports. If he could just reach the mansion, empty the safe, and secure a private charter out of Teterboro Airport, he could vanish before the local district attorney could issue a travel ban. He merged onto the highway, driving with reckless, manic desperation. He swerved wildly between lanes, his tires screeching as he took the Greenwich exit at 80 miles an hour. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He was furiously calculating flight times and offshore wire routes, convincing himself he could still outsmart everyone. He just needed 5 minutes inside his house. Richard turned sharply onto his private tree-lined street. He hit the button for the remote gate opener, but the heavy iron gates of his estate were already propped wide open. He slammed on the brakes, skidding violently across his own pristine cobblestone driveway. The quiet, secluded sanctuary of his high society life had been completely transformed into a highly coordinated staging ground. A dozen black government SUVs were parked aggressively across the perfectly manicured front lawn. Their tires had churned the expensive landscaping into a muddy mess. Men and women wearing dark tactical vests with bright yellow letters spelling out IRS, criminal investigation, were swarming the property like an army of ants. Richard sat paralyzed behind the steering wheel. Through his windshield, he watched 2 federal agents carry out heavy cardboard banker boxes, entirely overflowing with financial ledgers. Another team wheeled out towering server racks from his home office. On the marble portico, a group of agents were carefully carrying out Patricia's prized modern art collection, tagging each expensive painting with bright red seizure stickers. His house was being completely gutted in broad daylight. A guttural roar ripped from Richard's throat. He threw his car door open and sprinted across the ruined lawn, his expensive leather shoes slipping in the mud. He lunged toward a federal agent carrying a stack of computer hard drives. "Put those down right now," Richard screamed, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "Get out of my house. You have no right to be here. This is private property." 2 armed agents immediately stepped forward, placing their hands firmly on their holstered weapons and blocking his path to the front doors. "My daughter Caroline did this," Richard shouted wildly, pointing a shaking finger at the agents while spit flew from his lips. She orchestrated this entire raid. She is a vindictive sociopath. She is trying to steal my life over a ridiculous family grudge. I will sue every single one of you for trespassing." The heavy mahogany front doors swung open wide. The sharp, commanding click of heels on the marble porch silenced Richard's frantic screaming. Jasmine stepped out of the mansion and stood at the top of the grand staircase looking down at her father-in-law. The brilliant African-American federal tax prosecutor wore a sharply tailored navy blue trench coat. Her posture was flawless, her expression an absolute mask of cold professional fury. She held a thick stack of legal documents firmly in her right hand. Richard froze. He stared at Michael's wife, his mind completely failing to process why she was standing on his porch directing a federal raid. "Caroline didn't sign this warrant." Richard Jasmine stated, her clear authoritative voice echoing perfectly across the chaotic front lawn. "I did." She walked slowly down the marble steps holding up the federal warrant for him to see. "You thought you could use my husband as a human shield?" Jasmine continued, her eyes narrowing with lethal precision. "You thought you could ruin Michael's financial future to pay for your mistresses and your fake lifestyle. I spent the last 24 hours walking a federal judge through exactly how you committed federal tax evasion and how you systematically forged my husband's signature on millions of dollars of fraudulent commercial loans." Richard took a staggering step backward. His mouth opened and closed, but the arrogant bluster was entirely gone. He was looking at a woman who wielded the full, unyielding power of the United States government, and she was using it to completely annihilate him. "You are finished," Richard Jasmine said, stepping aside to let two armed agents move in behind him. "You are not flying offshore. You are not accessing your hidden safe. Every asset you ever touched is seized. Enjoy the bracelets." The federal agents grabbed Richard by the shoulders, pinning his arms firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly in the crisp morning air. Richard offered no resistance. His shoulders slumped forward and his head dropped toward his chest as the agents marched him across his muddy, ruined lawn toward the back of a waiting black SUV. The footage of my father being shoved into the back of a federal SUV played on a continuous loop across every major news network. The mighty Richard Wilson, stripped of his bespoke suits and his towering arrogance, was now just another white-collar criminal in federal custody. The empire had completely collapsed. But a rat backed into a corner will always bite, and Brittany was the most vicious rat in our family. She had managed to post bail by liquidating the last of her designer handbags and pawning the few pieces of jewelry the authorities had not yet seized as evidence. Facing imminent trial for felony identity theft, and watching her parents face complete ruin, Brittany resorted to the only currency she truly understood. She weaponized public sympathy. She fired her defense attorney and hired a notoriously aggressive crisis publicist. Within 24 hours, she was booked for an exclusive live sit-down interview on the most-watched daytime television program in the country. The studio lights of the Meredith Vance show were blindingly bright. Brittany walked onto the pristine soundstage looking like a completely different person. The stolen diamonds, the heavy glamorous makeup, and the skin-tight crimson dresses were entirely gone. She wore a modest pastel blue cardigan, buttoned all the way up a simple beige skirt and practical flat shoes. Her blonde hair was tied back in a demure, unstyled ponytail. She had intentionally applied pale foundation to make herself look gaunt, exhausted, and utterly fragile. She sat on the plush white interview chair, crossing her ankles and clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. Meredith Vance, known for her deeply empathetic interview style, leaned forward with a look of profound maternal concern. "It has been a devastating week for your family." Brittany Meredith began, her voice soothing and quiet. "Your father was arrested on federal tax charges. Your mother is facing conspiracy charges, and you are out on bail for felony identity theft. The media is painting your family as monsters. Tell us what is really happening." Brittany took a shaky breath. She looked directly into the primary camera, her lower lip quivering with Oscar-worthy precision. "It is an absolute nightmare," Meredith Brittany whispered. wiping a completely dry eye with her tissue. We are a normal, loving family. We have always supported each other. But my older sister Caroline, she is a deeply disturbed individual. She is a master manipulator. She orchestrated this entire media circus to destroy us. The live studio audience murmured. 300 people leaned forward in their seats, completely captivated by the tragic blonde woman on the stage. But the evidence Brittany Meredith gently pressed. The federal prosecutors claim there is a massive paper trail linking you to the stolen trust fund, and the assault charges against your father are incredibly severe. Brittany shook her head, vehemently clutching the tissue against her chest. Caroline set me up. She had access to all of our financial records. She stole her own money, transferred it to accounts with my name on them, and then called the federal authorities. She spent years plotting this. She wants to see us locked in cages because she cannot handle her own bitter insecurities. Meredith frowned slightly, tilting her head. But what about the physical assault? The police report states your father struck Caroline with a brick. The hospital records confirm she suffered a severe skull fracture. Brittany let out a soft, tragic sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, playing the role of a traumatized daughter forced to reveal a dark family secret. She has always been deeply jealous of my beauty, Meredith Brittany said, her voice echoing clearly through the silent studio. It sounds terrible to say, but it is the honest truth. She spent her entire life hiding in my shadow, hating me for being the face of our family. That scar on her face, she did it to herself. She took a brick and smashed her own face into the patio wall just to frame my poor, stressed father. He is a gentle man. He would never hurt anyone. She mutilated herself just to ruin his life. A collective gasp echoed through the studio. The audience was entirely hooked. Several women in the front row pressed their hands to their mouths, shaking their heads in absolute disgust at my supposed cruelty. Brittany was winning. She was successfully manipulating millions of daytime viewers, painting herself as the innocent victim of a sociopathic older sister. She lowered her tissue, preparing to deliver another tearful monologue when Meredith suddenly stopped speaking. The seasoned host pressed 2 fingers against the earpiece hidden in her right ear. Her empathetic expression shifted into a look of genuine confusion. "I am sorry to interrupt, Brittany," Meredith said, holding up a hand. "My producers are telling me we have an unexpected development. We actually have a live caller on the line who insisted on being patched through to the studio floor. Ethan, I understand you are Caroline's fiancé." Brittany froze. The carefully manufactured look of fragile innocence vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden stark flash of genuine panic. Her posture went entirely rigid. Ethan's voice rang out over the massive studio speakers. It was deep, resonant, and utterly merciless. "That is correct, Meredith," Ethan stated, his voice echoing through the massive soundstage. "I am Caroline's fiancé." Brittany gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles turning white. "Ethan," she stuttered, attempting to regain control of the narrative. "Please do not do this. You are being manipulated by her just like everyone else. She is sick, Ethan. You have to see that." Ethan did not even acknowledge her desperate plea. His voice sliced through her lies with absolute surgical precision. "Brittany, smile for the camera," Ethan commanded. "We just subpoenaed the neighbor's Ring doorbell footage from the barbecue, and we released it to every major news outlet exactly 10 minutes ago. You cannot lie your way out of high-definition video. Meredith, my team just sent the raw file to your control room. I highly suggest you play it for your audience right now." Meredith looked off camera to her producers. She gave a single sharp nod. The giant digital LED screen positioned directly behind the interview chairs flickered. The cheerful pastel graphics of the morning show instantly vanished. The screen cut to a crystal-clear, unedited 4K video feed. It was the neighbor's elevated security camera angled perfectly over the low privacy fence dividing our properties. The footage showed the backyard patio in brutal, indisputable clarity. The studio audience went dead silent. On the massive screen, Richard was red-faced and screaming. The audio was pristine, capturing every single vicious word. The audience watched in mounting horror as my father lunged toward the landscaping border. They watched him pick up the heavy, jagged red brick. They watched him raise it above his head with terrifying, aggressive force. And then he swung it. The sickening, visceral crunch of the brick connecting directly with my skull echoed through the television studio. On the screen, my body collapsed limply onto the hard stone patio. Bright red blood instantly pooled around my head, staining the expensive stone. But the most devastating part of the footage was not the violence. It was the reaction. As I lay bleeding and unconscious on the ground, the microphone captured the sound of Patricia laughing. It was a cold, mocking, utterly remorseless laugh. And right beside her, standing over my bleeding body, was Brittany. She did not call for help. She did not try to stop the bleeding. She just looked down at my shattered face and pulled out her smartphone to check her reflection. The studio audience erupted. It was not a gasp of sympathy. It was an explosion of pure, unadulterated horror. People were shouting at the stage. A woman in the second row stood up and pointed a furious finger directly at Brittany. The sounds of absolute disgust and revulsion filled the room. Brittany sat completely paralyzed under the bright studio lights. The giant screen behind her continued to loop the brutal reality of her family's inherent evil. She stared blankly into the camera lenses, surrounded by hundreds of screaming, furious people. The carefully constructed facade of the innocent victim had been completely pulverized on live national television, and there was nowhere left for her to run. The fallout from the national television broadcast was absolute, instantaneous, and completely apocalyptic. The brutal, unedited 4K security footage of my skull being fractured while my mother laughed and my sister casually checked her reflection became the most watched video on the internet within an hour. The Greenwich Country Club did not just quietly revoke Patricia's membership, they issued a highly publicized press release condemning the family and banning them from the premises for life. Federal prosecutors immediately denied Richard bail, citing him as a severe flight risk after discovering the offshore wire transfers. The man who had terrorized our family for decades was now sitting in a concrete federal holding cell, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit stripped of his tailored suits and his towering arrogance. 30 days had passed since Vanguard Holdings legally seized the Greenwich mansion due to the defaulted commercial loans. The formal eviction notice taped to the heavy mahogany front doors had officially expired. Patricia, however, completely refused to accept her new reality. With her husband locked away in federal prison and her high society social circle evaporating into thin air. Overnight, she descended into a manic state of utter delusion. She genuinely believed that if she just ignored the legal documents, the federal government and Vanguard Holdings would simply give up and go away. She padlocked the heavy wrought iron driveway gates with thick industrial chains. She fired the remaining estate staff who had not already quit for lack of payment. She dragged heavy antique oak dressers and gilded mirrors across the master bedroom floor, physically barricading the reinforced double doors from the inside. She isolated herself in the sprawling, empty mansion, surviving on whatever expensive pantry items were left and refusing to answer the phone. I arrived at the estate precisely at 9 o'clock the next morning. I rode in the passenger seat of a black Vanguard security SUV flanked by two marked Fairfield County Sheriff's cruisers. The morning air was crisp and biting. A crowd of local reporters and curious neighbors had already gathered at the edge of the property line, held back by yellow police tape. The media wanted to witness the final dismantling of the Wilson empire. The sheriffs stepped out of their cruisers carrying heavy steel bolt cutters. They snapped the industrial chains off the front gates with a loud metallic crack that echoed across the pristine front lawn. We drove up the sweeping cobblestone driveway and parked directly in front of the grand marble portico. The heavy thud of the sheriff pounding his fist against the front door shattered the quiet morning silence. Before the officers could produce the battering ram to force the lock, the French doors of the second-floor master balcony violently swung open. Patricia stepped out into the freezing air wearing nothing but sheer silk pajamas and a frantic, disheveled expression. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a tangled, matted rat's nest. Her expensive makeup was smeared under her eyes from days of crying and panic. She gripped the stone balustrade, looking down at me with unhinged fury. "I gave birth to you," Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with pure, hysterical desperation. "You owe me this house." I stepped out of the Vanguard SUV. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable nuisance and who had literally laughed while her husband nearly murdered me. I reached into the back seat of the vehicle and pulled out a high-powered police megaphone. I stepped onto the cobblestone driveway, locking eyes with her. "You gave birth to me, but you chose to be Brittany's mother," I announced, my voice booming through the megaphone and bouncing off the stone walls of the mansion. "You have 10 minutes before they breach the door." Patricia shrieked something entirely unintelligible and darted back inside, violently slamming the balcony doors shut. The 10 minutes passed in absolute deafening silence. When the deadline officially expired, the sheriffs did not hesitate. They took a heavy steel battering ram to the mahogany front doors, splintering the expensive wood and storming the grand foyer. I waited calmly by the SUV, listening to the muffled sounds of the officers breaking through the barricaded bedroom door upstairs. 15 minutes later, the front doors opened again. 2 armed deputies marched Patricia out onto the front porch. She was completely stripped of her high society armor. She was shivering uncontrollably in her thin silk pajamas, her feet shoved into mismatched slippers. She was clutching frantically to a visibly fake Chanel handbag that she must have purchased in an absolute panic after all her platinum credit cards were frozen. It was the perfect symbol of her entire life, a cheap counterfeit imitation of wealth. The deputies escorted her down the long, sweeping driveway, forcing her to walk past the flashing cameras of the local press and the judging eyes of her former neighbors. They marched her completely off the property and left her standing on the public curb outside the boundary line, shivering in the wind and entirely alone. Patricia scrambled to pull her cell phone from her fake designer bag. Her hands were shaking so violently, she almost dropped the device on the concrete. She quickly dialed her golden child's number, pressing the phone tightly to her ear and desperately needing a lifeline. "Brittany, you need to come get me right now." Patricia sobbed, her voice high and breathless with panic. "They threw me out. The sheriffs dragged me out of my own home. I am standing on the street in my pajamas. Come pick me up immediately." There was a long, hollow silence on the other end of the line. "I can't," Brittany replied. Her voice was completely dead, stripped of all its usual arrogant energy and devoid of all emotion. "The repo men are here." The line went completely dead. Brittany stood in the center of her sprawling, open-concept penthouse, staring blankly at the shattered screen of her smartphone. The luxurious sanctuary she had curated for her millions of followers was currently being dismantled piece by piece. Men in heavy work boots and high-visibility vests were moving methodically through the pristine white space. They carried out custom velvet sofas, imported marble coffee tables, and towering abstract sculptures. Following closely behind them were 2 stern representatives from the Federal Banking Authority, holding thick clipboards and cross-referencing serial numbers. Brittany had not just used my stolen trust fund to buy designer clothes and fund her extravagant vacations. She had committed textbook mortgage fraud. She had forged my signature and used my pristine credit history to secure the loan on the $3 million condominium. The moment the federal indictment came down, the bank immediately moved to void the fraudulent deed. The property did not belong to her, and neither did anything inside it. A burly mover brushed past her, carrying an armful of her custom silk curtains. Brittany reached out her hand, trembling violently. "You cannot take those," she shouted, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. "Those are mine. I paid for those." The federal bank representative stepped directly into her line of sight. His expression was completely devoid of sympathy. "You paid for nothing, Miss Wilson," the representative stated flatly. "Every asset in this unit was purchased with stolen funds. You have exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever basic unbranded clothing you can fit into 2 standard suitcases. Everything else is being seized to pay restitution to the victim." 5 minutes later, Brittany was unceremoniously shoved out of the heavy glass doors of the luxury high-rise. The building concierge, who used to greet her with a warm smile and a complimentary green juice, simply locked the doors behind her and turned his back. Brittany stumbled onto the cold concrete pavement, dragging two cheap canvas suitcases she had been forced to use after her monogrammed luggage was confiscated. She looked up and down the bustling city street, completely disoriented. A battered yellow taxi pulled up to the curb. The back door swung open, and Patricia practically fell out onto the sidewalk. The scene was almost painfully pathetic. My mother, the former queen of the Greenwich Country Club, was still wearing her thin silk pajamas. A pitying neighbor had apparently thrown a cheap, oversized wool coat over her shoulders before she fled the estate. She was clutching her fake Chanel handbag to her chest like a life preserver. The two women stared at each other on the dirty sidewalk. The pristine image of the Wilson family women was entirely annihilated. They were homeless, broke, and standing on the street corner like discarded trash. Brittany pulled out her phone, her fingers swiping frantically across the cracked screen. She dialed the number of her wealthiest influencer friend, a woman who had just last week called Brittany her absolute soulmate. The call went straight to a sterile automated voicemail. Brittany tried another number, then another. Then the private cell phone of the crisis publicist she had hired just 48 hours ago. Blocked. Every single one of them. Patricia was doing the exact same thing. She dialed the president of the charity gala committee. She dialed her personal tennis instructor. She dialed the women she had gossiped with over $1,000 bottles of champagne for the last 20 years. The result was identical. The high society world operates on a strict code of self-preservation. The moment the federal raid hit the news networks, the Wilson name became absolute poison. They were entirely excommunicated. "We have to call a hotel." Patricia hyperventilated, pacing back and forth on the concrete. "The Plaza, the Ritz, anywhere. I cannot be seen on the street like this. People are staring at me." With what money? Brittany snapped violently, throwing her phone into her canvas suitcase. "My accounts are frozen. Your accounts are seized. Dad is in a federal holding cell. We have absolutely nothing." Patricia stopped pacing. She looked at the towering glass high-rise behind them, and then looked at the two cheap suitcases sitting at her daughter's feet. The realization of the massive deception finally pierced through her manic delusion. Patricia stepped forward and raised her hand. She slapped Brittany across the face with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed down the busy street. "You told me you bought this place with brand sponsorships," Patricia screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. "You told me you were making millions from your social media deals. You lied to me. You dragged us into this mess." Brittany did not cower. She touched her stinging red cheek, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure venomous hatred. She stepped directly into her mother's personal space, matching her fury completely. "And you told me Dad was rich enough to cover my bail." Brittany snapped back, spitting the words into her mother's face. "You told me the business was invincible. We're both liars, Mom. We are exactly the same. We built our entire lives on fake money and fake stories, and now everyone knows." The two women stood chest to chest, breathing heavily. The toxic codependency that had fueled their relationship for decades had completely imploded. There was no one left to manipulate. There was no one left to blame. They had destroyed each other. A freezing gust of wind swept down the city street, causing Patricia to shiver violently in her silk pajamas. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the terrifying reality of their immediate situation. The sun was beginning to set, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. They were entirely homeless. Brittany crouched down on the sidewalk and unzipped the front pocket of her suitcase. She dumped the contents of her wallet onto the concrete. Patricia knelt beside her, emptying her fake Chanel bag. They frantically pushed aside useless platinum credit cards and seized bank tokens. They scraped together a crumpled $10 bill, a 5 and 5 singles. Exactly $20. It was the entire combined net worth of the Wilson women. Brittany stood up and waved her arm, flagging down an approaching taxi. The cab pulled to a stop at the curb. The driver rolled down the window, eyeing the disheveled woman in pajamas and the furious blonde girl dragging cheap luggage. "Where to?" the driver asked, sounding highly skeptical. Brittany looked at her mother. They had burned every bridge. They had destroyed my life. They had alienated their wealthy friends. There was literally only one door left in the entire world that might open for them. It was the ultimate walk of shame. "Take us to Michael and Jasmine's house," Brittany instructed, throwing the suitcases into the trunk. And drive fast. We only have $20. The cab pulled away from the curb, carrying them toward the brother they had despised, and the federal prosecutor who had just dismantled their empire. The sky over Fairfield County tore open just as the battered yellow taxi lurched to a halt in front of Michael and Jasmine's modest suburban home. Fat, freezing drops of rain pounded violently against the roof of the cab. Brittany shoved their crumpled $20 bill through the plastic partition, grumbling at the driver to pop the trunk. There was no tip. There was absolutely nothing left to give. Patricia stumbled out into the torrential downpour, her thin silk pajamas instantly plastering to her shivering skin. The cheap, oversized wool coat, a pity offering from a neighbor, offered zero protection against the bitter coastal wind. Brittany dragged their two cheap canvas suitcases out of the trunk, the plastic wheels grinding harshly against the wet asphalt. The taxi sped away immediately, leaving them standing in the dark. Patricia stared up at her son's house. She had always openly hated this property. She had spent years mocking its modest square footage, its lack of a gated driveway, and the fact that it sat in a middle-class neighborhood. Now, standing freezing in the rain, it looked like the ultimate impenetrable fortress. She marched up the concrete walkway, her mismatched slippers squelching in the deep puddles. Brittany followed closely behind her head, ducked against the biting rain, her pastel cardigan soaked completely through. Patricia hammered her fist against the heavy wooden front door. She did not ring the bell. She pounded with the frantic, furious entitlement of a queen demanding entry to her rightful sanctuary. The porch light flicked on, casting a harsh glare over the two drenched, shivering women. The deadbolt clicked loudly, and the door swung inward. Michael stood in the warm entryway, wearing a comfortable knit sweater and holding a steaming mug of coffee. The contrast between his peaceful domestic life and their apocalyptic ruin was incredibly stark. Patricia immediately pushed forward, expecting him to step aside and welcome her. Michael, thank God, Patricia gasped, her teeth chattering loudly as she clutched her fake Chanel bag. Pay the cab driver if he is still there. My accounts are temporarily frozen. Get the guest room ready immediately and bring me some dry towels. Brittany needs a hot shower right now. Michael did not move a single inch. His grip on the coffee mug tightened, but his expression remained absolutely stoic. He blocked the threshold completely, looking at his mother as if she were a total stranger. Patricia blinked rain dripping from her matted, highlighted hair directly into her eyes. Michael, what is wrong with you? She snapped, her old, arrogant edge bleeding through the shivering panic. Step aside and let your mother inside. We are freezing out here. A shadow moved in the warm, golden light of the hallway. Jasmine stepped up to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband. The brilliant federal tax prosecutor wore comfortable sweatpants and a thick woolen cardigan, her arms crossed firmly over her chest. She looked down at the women she had just legally annihilated with an expression of pure, unadulterated steel. She did not say a single word. Her presence alone was a massive, impenetrable wall. Patricia's face contorted with absolute revulsion. The sight of the daughter-in-law she had relentlessly tormented, now standing in a position of absolute power, pushed her over the edge. Tell your wife to step aside. Michael, Patricia sneered, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at Jasmine while rain washed down her face. This is family business. I am your mother. Blood is thicker than water. Michael looked at the woman who had spent his entire life treating him as a disposable pawn. He looked at the sister who had just tried to pin her felony crimes on him. Then he looked at his wife, the woman who had loved him, protected him, and saved him from going to federal prison alongside his father. Michael turned his gaze back to his mother, shaking his head with a look of profound, absolute disgust. Blood is what you left on Caroline's face, Michael stated, his voice ringing out clear and sharp over the sound of the pouring rain. Jasmine is my family. You forged my name on millions of dollars of fraudulent commercial loans, and you tried to ruin us to pay for your fake life. You are not my mother anymore. Patricia gasped, stepping back as if physically struck. Michael, you cannot do this. We have nowhere else to go. We have no money. You cannot leave us out here. Then you better start walking, Michael replied. He stepped back, pulling Jasmine with him. He slammed the heavy wooden door directly in their faces. The loud, heavy click of the deadbolt locking echoed over the porch like a gunshot. The porch light immediately snapped off, plunging them into absolute pitch-black darkness. Patricia let out a guttural, desperate wail, pounding her fists against the locked door until her knuckles bruised and bled. Brittany just stood in the freezing downpour, shivering violently in her soaked clothes. The reality was undeniable. There were no more lifelines. There was no more manipulation. They were entirely excommunicated from the human race. Brittany reached down, grabbing the slick handles of their cheap canvas suitcases. "Stop hitting the door, Mom," Brittany muttered, her voice dead and defeated. "He is not opening it." Patricia turned around, the heavy rain washing away the very last traces of her expensive makeup, revealing the hollow, terrified woman beneath. They had no phones that worked. They had no cash. They had absolutely nowhere to run. They turned their backs on the warm, safe house and began walking down the dark, flooded shoulder of the suburban street. The wind howled, tearing at their soaked clothes as cars drove past, splashing freezing, dirty water against their legs. They walked for 2 miles through the mud and the relentless rain, dragging their broken luggage behind them until they reached the edge of the interstate. A flickering neon sign buzzed in the darkness, illuminating a cheap, roach-infested motel sitting entirely alone by the highway. It was a filthy, decaying cinder-block building surrounded by cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. It was the ultimate destination for the mighty Wilson women. 3 months later, the suffocating stench of that cheap highway motel was nothing but a distant memory. For 90 days, Patricia and Brittany had lived in absolute squalor, forced to eat cheap fast food and sleep on lumpy, stained mattresses, while the legal system slowly tightened its grip around their throats. Now the miserable reality of their actions had finally culminated in the polished oak and sterile air of the federal courthouse. The combined criminal trial of the United States versus Richard Wilson and Brittany Wilson had officially begun. The media spectacle was absolutely unprecedented. Reporters packed the wooden benches in the gallery, scribbling furiously on their notepads. Richard was facing decades for felony assault, federal tax evasion, and massive commercial fraud. Brittany was staring down her own lengthy prison sentence for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. They sat at the defense table looking completely unrecognizable. Richard wore a poorly fitted beige suit, a far cry from his bespoke Italian tailoring. His skin was sallow, his shoulders slumped, and his posture completely broken. He looked like an old, defeated man. Brittany sat beside him in a drab gray blouse, staring blankly at the polished wooden table. The golden child was entirely stripped of her glamour. She looked exhausted, terrified, and incredibly small. The prosecution called their star witness. I walked through the swinging wooden gates and took my seat in the witness box. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and looked directly at the people who had tried to destroy me. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. I had survived their emotional abuse. I had survived the financial ruin they attempted to inflict on me, and I had survived the physical blow that was meant to end my life. I was untouchable. After the federal prosecutor finished walking me through the exact timeline of the financial theft and the brutal assault at the barbecue, Richard's defense attorney stood up. Arthur Sterling was a notoriously sleazy, high-priced litigator known for defending white-collar criminals by aggressively attacking the victims. He approached the podium, adjusting his silk tie with an arrogant smirk. He was determined to character assassinate me in front of the 12 men and women in the jury box. Sterling paced in front of the jury box, holding a thick manila file. He began firing questions designed to paint me as a vindictive, unstable sociopath who had orchestrated the entire downfall of my own family out of pure spite. He brought up medical records he had ruthlessly subpoenaed, twisting my past to fit his vile narrative. "Isn't it true you dropped out of college due to mental instability?" Sterling asked, his voice dripping with theatrical condescension. "You have a documented history of severe depression. You were prescribed heavy psychiatric medication. How can this jury possibly trust your memory of the events at that BBQ? You are an unstable, vindictive narrator with a massive grudge." He smiled smugly, looking toward the jury as if he had just delivered a fatal blow to my credibility. Richard sat up a little straighter at the defense table, a glimmer of his old arrogance returning. I leaned directly into the microphone. My voice did not waver a single fraction of an inch. I dropped out because my father refused to pay for my medication. While paying $50,000 for Brittany's plastic surgery, I stated the absolute truth, ringing clearly through the silent courtroom. He cut off my health insurance to punish me for not obeying his ridiculous demands. And you don't need my memory, Mr. Sterling. You have the 4K video. The jury physically recoiled. Several jurors glared directly at Richard and Brittany with undisguised disgust. The horrific reality of my father's financial abuse and physical violence completely shattered Sterling's attempt to paint me as the villain. Sterling's arrogant smirk faltered slightly, but he tried to pivot, ready to launch another attack to regain control of the courtroom. He opened his mouth to speak, but I did not let him. Before he could utter a single syllable, I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a single sheet of paper folded perfectly in half. I looked directly at the judge, bypassing the defense attorney entirely. "Also, Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying a sharp, lethal edge. The defense attorney's retainer was paid using funds from an offshore account that the FBI froze this morning. The entire courtroom went dead silent. Arthur Sterling froze completely mid-step. His jaw went slack. He looked at the document in my hand and then snapped his head around to look at Richard. I had spent the last 3 months working closely with Jasmine and the federal investigators, tracking every single hidden penny Richard had tried to squirrel away before his arrest. He had used a complex shell company in the Cayman Islands to wire a massive non-refundable $200,000 retainer to Sterling's law firm. But the feds had tracked the routing number. The money was officially seized as criminal proceeds. It was completely gone, and any future payments were permanently blocked. Sterling realized instantly that he was defending a massive, high-profile federal criminal case for absolutely free. He realized that the man sitting at the defense table had lied to him about the source of the funds, bringing the federal government's scrutiny directly to his own law firm's bank accounts. Sterling's face turned a brilliant shade of purple. The polished, confident litigator completely vanished. He practically sprinted back to the defense table and furiously threw his legal pad into his expensive leather briefcase. He did not care about the trial anymore. He did not care about Richard or Brittany. He only cared about his money and his own legal liability. "Your Honor?" Sterling stammered frantically, raising his hand to the judge while zipping his briefcase shut. The defense files an immediate emergency motion to withdraw as counsel for Richard and Brittany Wilson mid-trial. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Sterling by the sleeve of his suit. "Arthur, you cannot do this," Richard hissed, panic bleeding into his voice. "You cannot abandon us." Sterling violently yanked his arm free, looking at my father with absolute disgust. "Watch me," Richard Sterling spat loudly enough for the jury to hear. "I do not work for free, and I do not work for men who pay me with stolen federal evidence." The judge slammed his gavel down, demanding order in the court, but the damage was irreversible. Richard and Brittany were left sitting completely alone at the defense table, staring at the empty chair beside them. Their high-priced savior had abandoned them. They had no money, no lawyers, and no way out. The full crushing weight of the federal justice system was finally crashing down upon them. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down with a deafening crack that echoed through the stunned courtroom. The federal judge did not hesitate. He officially granted Arthur Sterling's emergency motion to withdraw from the case. Sterling snatched up his expensive leather briefcase and practically sprinted up the center aisle, refusing to even look at his former clients. The reality of the situation hit the defense table like a physical shockwave. Brittany began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as her perfectly manicured nails dug into the cheap fabric of her gray blouse. She frantically looked around the room, searching for a savior who did not exist. The judge peered over his reading glasses, addressing the defense table with absolute disdain. He informed them that a public defender would be assigned to Brittany immediately, given her complete lack of financial assets. He then turned his steely gaze to Richard, asking if he required a court-appointed attorney as well. Richard stood up, pulling his ill-fitting beige suit jacket straight. His towering ego absolutely refused to accept the sheer magnitude of his defeat. He puffed out his chest and raised his chin, assuming the posture of the untouchable corporate titan he used to be. Your Honor, I will not subject myself to a bargain bin lawyer. Richard announced, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance. I am a seasoned businessman. I understand the law perfectly. I elect to represent myself pro se. The judge issued a stern warning about the severe dangers of self-representation in a complex federal fraud and assault trial, but Richard waved him off dismissively. He believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed he could talk his way out of federal prison, just like he had talked his way out of every other consequence in his entire life. The moment the trial resumed, Richard's true legal strategy became horribly clear. He was going to throw his golden child directly to the wolves. Acting as his own defense attorney, Richard called Brittany to the witness stand. A court-appointed public defender had barely had time to sit down next to Brittany before she was forced to walk up and take the oath. She sat in the wooden witness box, her hands shaking violently. She looked at her father, expecting a lifeline. Instead, she found a predator. Richard paced in front of the jury box, pointing an accusing finger directly at his favorite daughter. He completely severed his case from hers in front of the entire courtroom. He painted a masterful picture of a spoiled, entitled influencer who had gone completely rogue. You stole my stepdaughter's identity entirely on your own, didn't you? Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. You wanted a luxury penthouse. You wanted to impress your shallow internet friends. You forged the documents and executed the mortgage fraud without my knowledge. I was just a victim of your boundless greed. Brittany stared at him in absolute paralyzed shock. The toxic alliance they had shared for her entire life instantly disintegrated. Her own father was offering her up for a 20-year federal prison sentence just to save his own skin. The betrayal shattered the last remaining fragment of her fragile psyche. The fear vanished from Brittany's eyes, replaced by a feral, unhinged rage. The golden child was dead. She gripped the edges of the wooden witness box, her knuckles turning pure white. He told me to take Caroline's identity. He said she was a disposable asset. Brittany screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical shriek that made the court reporter flinch. She turned directly to the jury, pointing violently back at Richard. He orchestrated the entire thing. He told me exactly which banking forms to forge. He needed cash to save his failing logistics company. The commercial loans were defaulting, and he was desperate. Richard lost whatever shred of composure he had left. His face turned a deep mottled purple. He slammed his fists down on the defense table, leaning aggressively toward the witness stand. You greedy brat, you spent it all on shoes and vacations, Richard yelled back, spitting the words across the courtroom. You never gave a single dime to the logistics company. You took the stolen money and blew it on designer garbage while my business burned to the ground. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. The judge hammered his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but the two of them were completely beyond reason. They were screaming over each other, tearing each other to pieces in front of a mesmerized jury and a gallery full of salivating reporters. Brittany's public defender quickly stood up and approached the judge's bench, holding a thick stack of printed documents. Brittany had brought receipts. The public defender handed the documents to the federal prosecutor, who immediately entered them into evidence. The prosecutor turned on the overhead projector, illuminating a massive screen for the jury. The screen displayed dozens of encrypted text messages between Richard and Brittany. The digital paper trail was entirely undeniable. The texts showed Richard explicitly instructing Brittany to use my social security number. They showed him providing her with the fraudulent banking contacts. They showed him demanding she wire the stolen funds into an offshore holding account to prop up his failing logistics empire. Richard stared at this massive screen, his mouth opening and closing silently. The undeniable proof of his guilt was staring him right in the face, provided by his own daughter. He slowly sank back into his chair at the defense table, utterly defeated. The mighty patriarch was finally broken. The judge demanded order, silencing the whispers buzzing through the gallery. The federal prosecutor stood up from her table, adjusting her blazer with a look of absolute triumph. The prosecution calls its final rebuttal. Witness, Your Honor, the prosecutor announced clearly. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom slowly swung open. Every single head in the room turned. Patricia stepped over the threshold. She was no longer wearing the rain-soaked silk pajamas from the motel. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her expression was cold, calculating, and entirely ruthless. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the defense table where her husband and daughter sat frozen in terror. Patricia walked straight down the center aisle, completely bypassing her family. She approached the wooden gate, unlatched it, and walked directly over to the prosecution's table. She took a seat right beside the federal prosecutor, folding her hands neatly on the table. She had spent the last 3 months rotting in a cheap highway motel, realizing that her husband was going to prison and her daughter was completely useless. So she did exactly what she always did. She looked out for herself. She had secretly contacted the federal authorities and taken a plea deal offering to testify against both her husband and her favorite daughter to completely avoid accessory charges. The ultimate betrayal was finally complete. Patricia's presence at the prosecution's table was the final fatal nail in the coffin of the Wilson family empire. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at her golden child. She sat with a rigid, desperate posture and systematically dismantled every single lie the defense had attempted to build. Over the course of 3 agonizing hours on the witness stand, Patricia traded her loyalty for her freedom. She handed the federal prosecutor the exact dates Richard had ordered the offshore transfers. She detailed exactly how Brittany had practiced forging my signature to secure the luxury penthouse. And most damning of all, she testified under oath about the afternoon of the family barbecue. She admitted that Richard had intentionally hurled the brick at my face and that they had all agreed to cover it up to protect his pristine corporate reputation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Guilty on all counts. Now, a week later, we were back in the same sterile mahogany-paneled room for the sentencing. The gallery was overflowing with reporters, former high society acquaintances, eager for gossip, and curious spectators. I sat in the front row with Ethan's hand wrapped warmly around mine. Michael and Jasmine sat directly beside us, forming an impenetrable wall of solidarity. The federal judge stared down from his elevated bench. His expression held absolutely no mercy. He addressed Patricia first. Because she had taken the plea deal, turned state's evidence, and cooperated fully with the federal authorities, she was spared a prison cell. The judge handed down a sentence of 500 hours of grueling community service and 5 years of strict supervised probation. Patricia stood there, in a deeply discounted, off-the-rack suit, her hands trembling. She had avoided a jail cell, but her punishment was its own kind of hell. She was completely destitute. The federal government had seized every bank account, every piece of jewelry, and every property associated with the Wilson name. She was a permanent pariah, permanently banished from the Greenwich elite, forced to live in a decaying, roach-infested motel and sweep public parks in a high-visibility vest. Next, the judge turned his attention to Brittany. My sister stood up on shaky legs. Without her designer contouring, her expensive hair extensions, and her arrogant smirk, she looked incredibly fragile and pathetically young. The judge did not mince words. He condemned her egregious sense of entitlement and her complete lack of remorse for stealing her sister's identity to fund a counterfeit lifestyle. For felony identity theft and wire fraud, you are sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility. The judge announced, his voice echoing off the heavy oak walls. Brittany collapsed into her chair, sobbing violently. The reality of a concrete cell and a metal toilet finally shattered her delusions of grandeur. She turned toward the prosecution table, reaching out a trembling, manicured hand toward Patricia. "Mom, please," Brittany wailed, her voice cracking with absolute terror. "Please do something." Patricia stared straight ahead. She did not blink. She did not turn her head. She completely ignored the daughter she had spoiled and weaponized for decades, entirely focused on preserving her own fragile survival. 2 federal marshals stepped forward, gripping Brittany by the arms and hauling her out of the courtroom through a side door. Her desperate cries faded into the corridor, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. Finally, it was Richard's turn. My father stood up. He tried to square his shoulders and lift his chin, desperately attempting to project the aura of the untouchable corporate titan he had once been. But the illusion was entirely shattered. He was just a hollow, broken man wearing a cheap, ill-fitting beige suit. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together. His eyes bored directly into Richard's soul. "Richard Wilson." The judge began, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "I have presided over this court for 2 decades. I have seen greed, and I have seen violence. But the sheer malice you have demonstrated toward your own flesh and blood is uniquely abhorrent. You built an empire on fraud, and when that empire began to crumble, you tried to sacrifice your own children to save yourself." Richard clenched his jaw, refusing to break eye contact, but a bead of sweat rolled down his pale temple. "You smashed a brick into your daughter's face because she didn't fit your twisted worldview?" The judge continued, pointing a stern finger directly at the defense table. "You tried to physically destroy her because you could not control her. Today she is the one walking out of this courtroom free while you lose your freedom." For the charges of aggravated assault, federal tax evasion, and massive commercial wire fraud, the judge brought his heavy wooden gavel down with a resounding final crack. "You are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison." The gallery erupted into a frenzy of hushed whispers and scratching pens. 8 years. For a man of Richard's age and absolute reliance on luxury, 8 years in a federal penitentiary was a definitive death sentence to his ego and his life as he knew it. The bailiffs immediately moved in. They grabbed Richard's arms, pulling them behind his back. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoed through the large room. Before they could march him away, I stood up from the front row. I released Ethan's hand and walked slowly toward the defense table. The bailiffs paused, glancing at the judge, who gave a slight nod, allowing me a final moment. Richard turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a toxic mixture of shock, fury, and sudden profound realization. He was looking at the daughter he had called a disposable asset, the daughter he had tried to erase. I stopped just 2 feet away from him. The courtroom was dead silent. Every single camera lens in the gallery was focused on my back. I reached up and deliberately brushed my hair back behind my ear, exposing the side of my face to the harsh fluorescent lights. There, tracing along my cheekbone, was the jagged, faded scar from the afternoon he had tried to break me. I held my head high, wearing that scar not as a mark of shame, but as a permanent badge of survival. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "You wanted to see if Ethan would still love me with a shattered face," I said, my voice steady, powerful, and ringing with absolute finality. "The answer is yes. But let's see who loves you when you have absolutely nothing." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on Richard Wilson, letting the bailiffs drag him away to a concrete cell. I walked back down the aisle, took Ethan's hand, and walked out of the heavy wooden doors into the bright, blinding sunlight of a brand new life. Exactly 365 days later, the crisp autumn air of the Hudson Valley carried the scent of crushed pine needles and sweet apple cider. The historic stone estate sat perched on a sweeping emerald hill, overlooking the winding silver ribbon of the river below. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow across the manicured lawns, illuminating the rows of white wooden chairs and the spectacular archway woven with fresh white roses and deep green eucalyptus. There were no flashing cameras hiding in the bushes. There were no frantic reporters shouting questions. There were absolutely no toxic family members lurking in the shadows, waiting to poison the atmosphere with fake country club smiles and veiled insults. It was a haven of pure, unadulterated peace. It was the exact opposite of everything I had grown up with, and it was absolutely perfect. I stood inside the bridal suite of the estate, taking a final deep breath. Jasmine stepped up behind me, gently adjusting the long, flowing train of my ivory silk gown. She wore a stunning, deep emerald dress, looking exceptionally radiant and fiercely proud as my maid of honor. She had been my rock through the darkest moments of the trial and the arduous rebuilding of my company. Now she was standing by my side for the happiest day of my life. "You look breathtaking," Caroline, Jasmine whispered, her voice thick with genuine emotion. "You did it. You really won." I smiled, looking at my reflection in the antique mirror. I did not look like the terrified girl bleeding on a patio. I looked like a woman who had walked through absolute hell and forged herself into titanium. I walked out onto the stone patio, where the string quartet was playing a soft acoustic melody that floated beautifully over the quiet gathering of our closest chosen friends and colleagues. Michael was waiting for me at the edge of the white runner. He looked incredibly sharp in his tailored tuxedo. When he saw me, his eyes immediately filled with unshed tears. He offered me his arm, and I linked mine through it, holding on tight. Michael was the brother I had always deserved. He had protected me, fought for me, and helped me build an empire from the ashes of my ruined past. Today he was rightfully taking the place of the father who had tried to destroy me. "Are you ready to do this?" Michael asked, patting my hand gently. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I replied. We walked down the aisle together. I did not scan the crowd for approval. I did not worry about maintaining a flawless social facade. I only looked straight ahead at the man waiting for me at the end of the runner. Ethan stood under the floral arch looking incredibly handsome and deeply moved. The way he looked at me made the rest of the world completely fade away. He stepped forward, taking my hands from Michael with a respectful nod. Ethan reached up and delicately lifted the sheer white veil from my face. He did not look away. He did not flinch. He reached out and gently traced the side of my cheek. He leaned in and pressed a soft, lingering kiss directly onto the faded, jagged scar that marked my skin. "You are the most beautiful, terrifyingly brilliant woman I know," Ethan whispered, his voice raw with absolute devotion and awe. The ceremony was intimate, joyous, and completely authentic. We exchanged vows that we had written ourselves, promising to protect each other, build together, and cherish the genuine love we had fought so incredibly hard to secure. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, the small crowd of our true friends erupted into genuine, joyous applause. Later that evening, the reception was in full swing under a massive canopy of sparkling string lights. Ethan and I stood on the stone balcony raising crystal flutes filled with high-end vintage champagne. We toasted to our future, surrounded by the warmth and laughter of people who loved us for exactly who we were. Meanwhile, miles away, the universe was executing its own relentless version of absolute justice. In the lavish, pristine bathrooms of the Greenwich Country Club, Patricia dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor. She was wearing a cheap, heavily stained gray uniform. The harsh chemical smell of industrial bleach burned her nostrils as she aggressively scrubbed the porcelain rim of a toilet bowl. The heavy wooden door of the restroom swung open, and two wealthy society matrons walked in. They were women Patricia used to host at her lavish dinner parties. They paused, looking down at the woman scrubbing the floor with absolute undisguised disgust. Patricia ducked her head, hiding her face behind her greasy, unwashed hair, enduring the brutal, humiliating sneers of her former friends in absolute silence. In a federal penitentiary 100 miles away, Richard sat on a thin, lumpy mattress. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit that swallowed his shrinking frame. The brilliant corporate titan was completely gone. He sat in total isolation, surrounded by cold, unforgiving concrete, staring blankly at a peeling cinder block wall. He had no money, no power, and absolutely no one left to manipulate. The heavy steel door of his cell slammed shut, locking him in a cage of his own creation. In a separate federal correctional facility, Brittany shoved another massive load of rough canvas uniforms into a giant industrial washing machine. The harsh fluorescent lights beat down on her sweat-drenched face. Her fingernails were chipped and broken, her skin dull and exhausted. The golden child was entirely trapped in the agonizing mundane drudgery she had spent her entire life looking down upon. I stood on the balcony, leaning back against my husband's chest, taking a sip of the crisp champagne. I looked out over the sweeping Hudson Valley, watching the stars begin to pinpoint the dark velvet sky. I had survived their violence, their theft, and their endless emotional cruelty. I had taken every single thing they threw at me and turned it into unshakable power. They tried to bury me with a brick. They didn't realize I would use it to build my empire. The most profound lesson from this journey of betrayal is that our worth is never defined by the people who attempt to destroy us. When toxic family members weaponize our vulnerabilities, it reflects their own brokenness rather than our inherent value. True power is found not in fighting for their conditional approval, but in reclaiming our absolute independence and building a life of authentic success. We can take the very stones meant to break us and use them to construct our own unshakable empires. Have you ever turned a painful betrayal into your greatest strength? Let me know in the comments below.